The panel you're about to see is titled Power and Equity, Sexism and Ceramics. We're also addressing misogyny because it goes hand in hand with sexism and can't really talk about one without talking about the other. My name is Ayumi Horie, and Sunshine Cobb and I decided to tackle this topic after continuing to hear story after story about women, trans, and non-binary folks enduring bad behavior that's been normalized in our field and accepted as an inevitable spillover from society at large. We're not experts in this topic, but we've been in this field long enough to know that either the systems of accountability are broken or there are no systems in place in certain situations to protect people. It's no longer an option to look the other way. We need to grow up as a field, and we need to invest in prevention as much as accountability. We want to make it clear that this is just the beginning of what is a massive conversation in ceramics, that it's always present and rarely talked about. We need to know our own history and take a fresh look at it. We conceived of this panel as a real nuts and bolts informational session where people could walk away knowing more about how the law does or does not protect them and what protocols, policies, and trainings organizations ought to have in place to address this issue. We also want to give people on a personal level tools to protect, support, and care for their mental health and well-being. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the panel and who's contributed stories to us. We're keeping the Google form open to continue to collect stories, so please consider submitting. We've been overwhelmed at the outpouring of support, and we look forward to finding ways, with your input and help, to keep this conversation alive so we can break these cycles of harm and make the culture of ceramics safe for everyone. Okay, thank you very much. Here we go. I want to start by thanking you for coming to this very important conversation tonight. And we know that for many of you, this content will bring up painful memories and may be triggering. So we thank you for bravely showing up. We also want to say right off the bat that we're not here to debate whether or not sexism or misogyny exists in ceramics. It's real. We believe the stories we've been told. We believe what we've seen with our eyes and our ears and our bodies. And we believe in our own experiences. We know that each one of us cares about this community as well. The conversation tonight is about systems of power and how to shift them in order to make our systems more equitable. If and when individual names come up, we're talking about them within a framework of a patriarchal system that we all inhabit, wherever we live. That's really our starting point. We haven't prepared a land acknowledgement. However, almost all of us are zooming in from unceded land occupied by patriarchal and colonial systems of power. Indigenous women have been victims of sexual and gender-based violence for centuries and continue. To learn more, go to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women USA and also Native Women's Wilderness. We do want to acknowledge that we don't have the voices of a Black, Brown, or Indigenous person on this panel, and that is a deficit that we take responsibility for. Sunshine Cobb is a full-time potter living in Helena, Montana. She frequently travels and online these days, the country as an invited lecturer and demonstrating artist. Her work has drawn praise for its whimsical rustic style. She's considered an important contemporary functional potter, hailed in both academic and commercial circles, and is consistently featured in art exhibitions throughout the country. A strong online and social media presence, she represents an innovator in online business models in an ever-changing ceramics field and a leading advocate for functional art and modern living. She's outspoken in the area of artists' rights and fair pay. Besides volunteering demonstration time for local K-12 art programs, she works with artists seeking mentorship to develop their practice and to learn about the field they're seeking to enter. She's also the author of a book published in 2018 called Mastering Hand Building with Voyager Press. She uses the pronouns she, they, and her visual description is, and this is, all these visual descriptions are written by the panelists. A middle-aged white woman, hair is in short faux hawk style, wears glasses with a heavy set build. Dana Lossia is a partner in the law firm of Levy, Ratner, PC in New York City, which specializes in labor and employment law. Dana represents labor unions in many different industries, and one of her primary clients is Local 2110 of the UAW, which represents members at many museums and cultural institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the New Museum of Contemporary Art, the Bronx Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and soon we hope the Whitney. Dana also litigates employment cases, including a successful class action race discrimination case against the New York City Fire Department, which led to a federal court requiring the FDNY to hire more than 100 Black firefighter candidates who'd been denied jobs. She also represents employees in sex discrimination, pregnancy discrimination, and sexual harassment claims. Her pronouns are she, her, and Dana is a middle-aged Middle Eastern woman with a fuchsia top on. Jenni Sorkin is an associate professor of history and art and architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. Her publications include Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community, Revolution in the Making, Abstract Sculpture by Women Artists, 1947 to 2016, and the forthcoming book, Art in California, and numerous essays, journals, and exhibition catalogs. She was educated at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Bard College, and received her PhD from Yale University. She's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Modern Craft. Her pronouns are she, her. Jenni wears glasses, but still squints and is trying to grow out her dirty blonde hair. And finally, myself, Ayumi Horie, is a full-time studio potter in Portland, Maine. She's recognized in the field of craft for championing the aesthetics of kawaii, for her online presence in videos, and her political activism. In 2020, she became an honorary member of NCECA for her contributions to the ceramics field. In 2015, she was awarded a Distinguished Fellow in Craft grant from United States Artists. And in 2011, she was the first recipient of Ceramics Monthly Ceramic Artist of the Year Award. She has co-founded multiple projects, including Obamaware, Handmade for Japan, the Democratic Cup, Pots in Action, and Portland Brick. She has served on multiple national boards, including the Archie Bray Foundation, the American Craft Council, and is currently vice president of the board at Haystack Mountain School of Crafts. Her pronouns are she, her. Ayumi is a middle-aged biracial woman whose father was Japanese and her mother is white. She wears hexagonal glasses, presents as androgynous, and is wearing a blue shirt. I want to share the agenda with you just so you have an idea of what's happening tonight. I'm going to start with welcome, thank yous. I've already introduced the panelists. I'm going to talk about our goal in tonight's conversation, community practices or guidelines, a quick Zoom orientation, a definition of terms. We'd like to do a poll tonight of the participants. We'd like to talk about why this is happening now and talk about the Google form that we've set up that has been accepting stories of harassment, abuse, harm, and assault. Jenni Sorkin will present a historical overview after this. Dana Lossia will present hypothetical case studies that we have put together from the stories that have been submitted. Sunshine will follow with more case studies, more from a kind of mental health and well-being standpoint. Dana will look at these case studies from a legal standpoint. Sunshine will also present a sort of checklist for advocacy. And I'll wrap up with a call to action, talk a little bit about our budget and a few other things, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A at the end. Tonight's goal is to have a generative community conversation about sexism and misogyny in ceramics. We acknowledge decades of pain and trauma within the field. We want to empower individuals with information and tools for advocacy. We're focusing on systems, not individuals. We're asking that institutions establish and re-examine protocols and policies for accountability, and that they develop implicit bias, empathy, and sexual harassment training, and anti-oppression trainings for prevention in order to change the culture of the field. Be respectful and professional. No name calling, hate speech, discrimination, bullying, or harassment. We have a zero tolerance policy for trolls and for anyone who interrupts, diverts, or denigrates anyone. They'll be promptly removed. We want this to be as safe a space as possible. Communicate empathy and assume best intentions. We know that for some in this conversation, it may be triggering. We're not using this forum tonight to call out individuals or organizations. And we also want to acknowledge that there's an enormous amount of pain and anger in the community and in the audience tonight. Tonight, we want to focus on systems so we can advance towards shifting power imbalances in our field. Make no assumptions about sexual orientation, gender identity, or anything else about their identity. And we also encourage you to add your pronouns to your name. If you hover over the upper right corner of your profile picture, there'll be 3 buttons, and you can rename and add your pronouns there. We realize that this conversation will be uncomfortable for some people. Try to stay with your discomfort and struggle. We're all learning, and it's actually a sign of learning. Expect and accept that there will not be closure tonight. We're really thinking of this as a beginning of a conversation, even though we know that many people have been working toward more equity and justice in the field. I want to next define some terms. We're using individual identity terms expansively to include many people impacted by sexism in our field. When we say woman or women, we mean anyone identifying as a woman or women, including trans women and sometimes affinity groups who may share some experience of women in our field, like non-binary folks. When we say men, we're specifically speaking of a cisgender male and often somebody with a heterosexual orientation. We've titled this panel Sexism and Ceramics, but of course you've probably figured out by now that it is also going to address misogyny. So we want to begin by defining sexism and misogyny. I've taken the definitions from the feminist philosopher, the author named Kate Manne, and Sadie's put the link to her website in the chat. So Kate Manne defines sexism as an ideology that rationalizes gender stereotypes, norms, and expectations in order to prove the superiority of men. Biological reasons are often given to reinforce these ideas. For example, men are naturally leaders and women are more caring, or men naturally are better at wood firing and have a better grasp of technical knowledge, for example. So sexism as an ideology for rationalizing gender stereotypes. In contrast, and sexism and misogyny often work hand in hand together. Misogyny is commonly understood as a hatred toward women and girls, and this is certainly true for some people, but it doesn't really address the system, and it's not actually that helpful. So we're working with Kate Manne's updated definition, which defines misogyny as a social system that uses the ideology of sexism to enforce male entitlement, superiority, and domination. It's basically the policing arm of sexism that's meant to, quote unquote, keep women in their place, which of course means non-binary and trans folks as well. It's the use of hostility to diminish, silence, mansplain, gaslight, harass, assault women in order to keep the patriarchal system in place. Misogyny makes sure that a male-dominated system is not disrupted. So this is a global phenomenon that transcends culture and place. We're looking at patterns, and by and large, it's primarily a system that men have used against women. However, women have also taken a part in upholding the patriarchy, and also all men aren't sexist. So none of this is, absolutely binary. I think we're all complicit to differing degrees, and it's incumbent on each of us to self-reflect about how we've internalized and accepted these systems, how we've negotiated them in our own lives, whether to thrive or just to survive. The main thing is that it's critical that we look at patterns and systems instead of getting distracted by bad actors. We need everyone, and men in particular, to be stepping up to the plate to hold each other accountable in private and public spaces if things are ever going to change. It's also critical that we talk about intersectionality. So we're committed in this discussion to look at it through the lens of intersectionality. In 1989, a Black feminist scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality to describe how oppressions or privileges can be compounded or exacerbated when people's multiple identities intersect. For example, when a Black trans woman is discriminated against, it's impossible to disentangle whether it's their gender, race, or sexuality that people are discriminating against, or the eutectic, to use a ceramics term, that's created by all these aspects to create even more marginalization. And before we get to the other panelists, I want to talk about the question of why this is happening now, why this panel is happening now, why we're addressing this. One answer is that actually that people have been fighting back and resisting sexism and misogyny for a long time in ceramics. I think we have change makers in this room who've spoken up time and time again as acts of resistance, but the systems in place have been too powerful until now. We hope that we're finally at a tipping point, and we're continuing the work the change makers have already done, and we want to thank them for their courage in standing up for themselves and for the rest of us. We would also not be here if it wasn't for the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. Our belief is that our field has been painfully slow in recognizing both these movements. We're starting to catch up, but as evidence of where we're at as a field, one of our most well-regarded organizations within ceramics did not adopt a sexual harassment policy or code of conduct until 9 months ago. Many of our organizations have begun doing some self-reflection, and some have gone through the work of strategic plans that center anti-oppression and equity. I think we're on the right path, but I'm also seeing that some of the work is being done shallowly for optics, instead of really addressing underlying inequities in governance and structure. And those are really what, in a lot of ways, we need to focus on as a way to dismantle hierarchies and flatten power dynamics. Questions about who is in the room, who is not in the room, who have we driven out of the field, and just how do we create a culture that truly nurtures everyone and lives the values that we like to think that we have. We know that there's been a tremendous amount of fear and of course, shame and humiliation in sharing personal stories in the field. There is a legitimate fear of retaliation, and many of people have submitted anonymously because of that. When we first, well, we're deleting submissions that were submitted before June 2nd. So unless you've given us express permission to keep them for future feminist scholarship, we will delete them tomorrow. If you have submitted anonymously before June 2nd and you want us to keep the story, please resubmit your story. And just so you know, under no circumstances will we share your story without your permission. There are some general takeaways that we've gotten from the stories that have been submitted. Most of them are from academia, which ostensibly have policies in place. So the question then becomes, why are these policies not working and how can they be reformed? As a last resort, people are turning to social media to tell their stories publicly. Some recurring themes are, or problems that have been identified are drinking within the field, the kind of bro culture in general, and especially in wood firing, the abuse of power of faculty and also grads against undergrads, pay gaps, galleries not promoting female artists, terrible family leave policies. These were all consistent themes within all the stories. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Jenni for her historical overview. And Jenni, when you're done, you can pass it off to Dana.
Thank you so much, Ayumi and Sunshine and Dana, but especially Ayumi and Sunshine for being the real organizers and movers and shakers of this panel. I'm going to share my screen and offer a brief historical overview of the field. But what I want to say essentially is that one of the major problems in this field for me as an art historian is that ceramics as a field doesn't know its own history. It is not taught, ceramics history is not taught regularly in ceramics programs around the country. And that happens in most craft programs in which craftspeople, practitioners are left to have to be both the technical and artisan and artists driving their schools programs and their community workshops, as well as the burden of teaching history also falls to them. So people often fall back on whatever they were taught, whatever program they came out of, whatever teacher they had, and that creates a kind of ongoing culture of insularity and not understanding the sort of broad significance of how we got to where we are now. So this is just to start out with some basic facts here about the GI Bill and the way in which the GI Bill and the post-war period in the United States is already geared toward promoting and helping men in their careers. The GI Bill was offered to veterans starting in 44. It ends, the golden era is through 57. There's a lesser version of it after the Korean War, and in each subsequent war, even into the present, the benefits have continually been diminished. But what you're seeing here is this poster, "Shall I Go Back to School?" You can see this is aimed at men. And this is how many people like Peter Volkas, who you see shirtless over here, ended up getting to do MFAs. These were aimed at working class student veterans, many who would not have had the means, the money, or the encouragement to go to college on their own, or also to do Master of Fine Arts programs after college. So Peter Volkas is one of our ultimate heroes in the field of ceramics in the sense that he fits many categories that we champion today. He is a child of Greek immigrants, so he's a first-gen college student, working class, raised in Montana, a state without many access opportunities to higher education. There's a Montana State Teachers College that he ends up attending and studies with Francis Senska. Part of what I argue in my own scholarship is that Peter Volkas is strongly shaped by women practitioners, and the entirety of the post-war period really has women at the helm, but they have not been celebrated historically for their contributions. So this is just an image of Paul Soldner on the far left with, once again, another shirtless Peter Volkas and John Mason making these large-scale sculptures at Otis College of Art and Design. Just a quick list here. This is not comprehensive by any means. GI Bill recipients that you see here: Rudy Audio, Lillian Boschen, who I've starred, is a woman who is a recipient. Noah Purfoy, who is a Black artist based in Los Angeles for the post-war period. Kenneth Nolan, Robert Rauschenberg, Francis Senska, who was Volkas's teacher, Paul Soldner, Curtis Tan, who is a Black enamelist, Peter Volkas. There's many, many more GI Bill recipients, but the basic lesson here is that women who were part of the civilian service during wartime were not offered GI benefits. That means that they did not get any access to higher education free from the US government. So the entirety of the MFA programs that were set up in this golden age that I'm describing is really the expansion of higher education in this country, starting in the late 40s after wartime. So this is when arts education expands exponentially to community colleges, teachers' colleges, and big research universities. And that is where most people end up with any kind of craft training. And that's when most art programs in this country actually begin. So most of the programs that many of us went to start in this period. Some date before that, but most of them date to that period. What this means is that women are left out of the ability to get a low-cost MFA, and they are routinely directed to teacher training, that is for secondary school education, rather than Masters of Fine Arts programs. So it's already terrifically difficult to be a woman trying to get an MFA in the post-war period because all the spots are reserved for men. And they are expressly reserved for men because of these GI Bill benefits that have a direct link to federal encouragement. And so the few women that get access to this money, the two I've starred here are women who actually served in the US Navy and became ceramic artists of their own volition and ended up with careers that were not quite as esteemed as their male peers. And so women in this era get redirected into teacher training, secondary school programs, and men routinely get redirected into fine arts programs and in MFA programs that lead to community college, university, and college level jobs. And that's because the MFA becomes the terminal degree. And if you do not have an MFA, you cannot teach at that level. So that already takes women out of the running. Women have already been knocked out of painting and sculpture, which are already the most sexist departments in the United States at this time, which is why ceramics is sometimes considered a backdoor discipline for offering women more and better opportunities. And yet ceramics also ends up in the same quandary or the same problem of not accepting women during this era. So just a few women that I want to highlight here. Jane Hartzuk, and this is the way in which women created workarounds for themselves financially by teaching in community-driven spaces, which is not different than what we're seeing today. When people can't get teaching jobs, many people want to teach in community workshops. They want to find other means outside of academia that are more freeing, that involve a different kind of public. But women were largely teaching in community-driven settings and in therapeutic settings in the post-war period. They didn't have access to the jobs because of sexism and because of misogyny in higher education. Jane Hartzuk is known to many of you. They named the gallery for her at Greenwich House. This is the pottery in New York City that's attached to the Settlement House, Greenwich House. And this is her with students. Jane Hartzuk ends up in a position in which she largely invites a roster of male artists into her space to do demos, a kind of common, unconscious, ingrained sexism that happens throughout the post-war period in which women get slated into the role of the teacher and men get slated into the role of the artist. Lillian Boschen was the first original director of the Archie Bray Foundation and Pottery when it was set up in Montana in 1951. She's got an interesting story in the sense that with her GI Bill money, she studies for an MFA alongside Peter Volkas at the California College of Arts, and she is chosen to direct the pottery. She graduates ahead of Volkas. She's pegged to direct the pottery only until Volkas finishes school. So she's like a temporary director, but she is considered the better director, that she has more attention to detail, that she has a willingness to do things which Pete Volkas looked at as a nuisance, that she was able to follow Bray's directions, which he thought that Pete Volkas would not. And yet at the end of this 9-month period, Bray elected to retain Volkas instead of Boschen because he had an emerging national reputation that was really due to the fact that he was a man and that it seemed better to have a man at the helm of this, that he had a charisma that was somehow unavailable to her. So there was an inherent sexism in this. Everything at the Bray, the Visiting Artist Fellowships, has subsequently been named for Volkas. That's a question of whether or not there are people who think that perhaps things should be renamed for Boschen as a way to honor her, in the sense that Jane Hartzuk Gallery has honored Jane Hartzuk. But this sort of firing decimates Boschen's career. She doesn't ever show outside of Montana. I couldn't find an exhibition record for her out of Virginia City, Montana, which is where she set up a small pottery on her own in '52. She basically exits the field at some point. So she becomes, for me, an early case study of how women are squeezed out or put out of the field. And I think that there's many people who can reflect back on their own MFA experience and think about all the talented women who have dropped out along the way, that this field is essentially littered with stories and bodies of people who did not feel that they could hack it because they did not feel supported, they were not supported, they were ridiculed at some point for the kind of imagery they were doing in graduate school, for their outspokenness, for their interest in perhaps the female body and bodily forms. There's a whole host of these kinds of stories. Boschen was a production potter. That was her trade. That was her era. But I think for me, she represents this early person who's put out of the field that we don't know what happens to her, really. This is just to show you a kind of ongoing sexualized imagery that happens in the field and has been routinely celebrated as some of these sort of so-called hits of 60s era funk sculpture. Fred Bauer's Like a Flex, which is this very phallic camera in which the penis becomes a seeing eye. There's kind of voyeuristic imagery here. Arneson's typewriter on the right substitutes keys for women's fingernails, which becomes a kind of emblem of female labor and sort of pink collar secretarial work, that only women do this work. So for me, it's sort of an emblem of class. It's a gesture about that as well. But just that there's a kind of running commentary, a jokiness that is often distasteful, but useful for me as a historian in thinking about and mapping this imagery and seeing what was celebrated at various times throughout the 20th century, but in particular the 60s. I also want to say that this imagery is not limited to ceramics. A lot of it comes from or derives from pop culture. This is Tom Wesselman from around the same time, Bedroom Tit Box, in which he made a kind of assemblage sculpture in which it could only be completed with a live human breast being inserted into the form. There's something kind of fascinating about this, but you see it is about sort of reducing women to their body parts, which is what many ceramic artists are also doing. It is objectifying women and taking away their wholeness and their ability to be whole people. It's about a fragmenting of the body and objectification. This is also just a series of posters that I'm going to end with that we've collected. Ayumi has managed to get people to send her, of Paul Soldner's, and this is just a kind of, I guess I should say that some of these are disturbing to people, that were published in Ceramics Monthly, Studio Potter, hung on studio walls because of their sheer outrageousness. What they represent is also the fact that male artists during this era, Paul Soldner in particular, were able to innovate machinery and ceramics equipment and end up making quite a good living doing this through this kind of mechanized industrialization of pottery equipment, and that these were the kind of outrageous sexualized posters made in order to sell this equipment, and were then collected almost as iconic emblems, hung up in studios around the country, and become sort of ways in which they kind of validate bad behavior in the studio because of this compulsion for nudity, this objectifying women. Here's one called Clayboy that is a takeoff on Playboy, but also kind of has an ugly racial component to this. So does It's a Jungle is blatantly racist, which is also another way of saying that the field is incredibly demoralizing to people of color, that this is historically a very white history. This is a field that hasn't figured out how to become intersectional and diversified fully, that there's a lot of rural spaces in ceramics in many places like red states that are not always friendly to queer people, people of color, trans people. And I just want to acknowledge that as a kind of ongoing issue in our field that I think doesn't affect the urban art world in quite the same way, because ceramics does have a really sprawling rural connection and network. I'm going to just end here, but thank you very much. And this is just to tell you this. All of the images I've drawn from my book, Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community, which was published in 2016 and really is the first gendered case study system looking at the post-war era in the field. This community has been really wonderful in embracing this book, and I really appreciate it. And I have a new book coming out that is fully intersectional and focuses on the 20th century till the present history of art in California. There's a lot of craft history in this, and I've strove to include as much intersectional, non-white, and queer material as I possibly could excavate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jenni. That was fascinating. Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. I'm so happy to be talking to you all. As Ayumi said, I'm going to focus on sexual harassment and sex discrimination, mostly in the workplace and then a little bit in educational institutions from a legal perspective. Disclaimer, none of this is legal advice to any of you as individuals. You should talk to a lawyer if you feel that you may have a legal issue. But I'm going to talk through some hypothetical situations that might be familiar to folks here and use those stories to talk about what is illegal, who is protected by the laws, how you can respond to conduct you believe may be illegal, and how quickly you have to do so. So imagine, although no one would want to be in this situation, you're an employee at a relatively large nonprofit organization focusing on ceramics, and you accepted a salary that you assumed was the standard pay for your role, and you later learn that you have been placed at a lower level of pay than men with equal or lesser qualifications or experience. In this hypothetical, the you is a woman. So you ask about this, the differential in pay, and you're told that the organization only offers up to 10% more than what you were earning in your previous position. They had asked you what you were previously earning. In your previous position was pretty low paid compared to some of the now, male employees that you're now working with. As your employment moves on, you notice that your mentor, who is superior to you in the organization, is insisting that everyone attend these evening events where there's heavy drinking and he's often drunk. And early on, he makes unwanted sexual advances, which you ignore at first, but it later becomes very overt, and he indicates that if you and he were closer, he could select you as the lead for firing. You rebuff him, and he chooses someone else to fire the kiln. You complain to the director of the organization, but in the coming weeks, these propositions from the mentor figure continue, and you start to notice that your work is being criticized and scrutinized and called into question. Soon you're called in for a meeting with the director and told, it doesn't seem like this position is a good fit for you. We think you should move on. In the meeting, the director says, let me give you some advice as you're going through your career. In the future, try to be more of a team player. Just do a better job of building relationships with others. Don't be a squeaky wheel. And you tell the director that losing this job will be a financial hit for you. So in response, the employer offers you pay for the rest of the year, but only if you sign a waiver and release of claims, a confidentiality agreement, and a non-disparagement agreement that would prevent you from making any negative remarks, either about the organization or the harasser, to anyone outside your immediate family. You decide not to sign the agreement because you want to be able to share your experience with your community. And you go on to write about your experience, post it on the internet, and the harasser sues you for defamation, seeking money for the damage you've caused to his reputation. This is our all bad things that could possibly happen. So now I'm going to take you through, again, disclaimer, I'm not offering anyone specific legal advice, but to sort of talk through the story and pick apart some of the things that come out of it. Pay. Remember at the start of the story, you found out you were paid less than men. One general piece of advice, and this is empowering to all people in the workplace, in my opinion, is to really insist upon transparency around pay in the organization that you're in. organizations should actually go further than being transparent about pay, which includes benefits. And they should go further than transparency, and they should conduct a pay equity analysis of their own pay practices to try to detect disparities in compensation between men and women, across race, and find those places where the disparity can't be explained by legitimate business, reason. Some states have actually passed laws that forbid employers from pegging pay for a new hire to their prior salary, because legislatures have recognized that using prior salaries perpetuates the gender pay gap. Even if prior salary was not the reason for the disparity, a disparity in pay between men and women who are doing substantially equal work could be grounds for a legal claim under the Equal Pay Act. And of course, disparities in hiring and promotion and other opportunities could be grounds for a legal claim of sex discrimination or some other kind of discrimination. For the purpose of this hypothetical, we'll focus more on sex-based discrimination and harassment. So, sexual harassment can include, I think, first of all, before I give you a definition, I think we should acknowledge that we know what it is when we experience it, and that if you think that it's happening, you probably should consult with an attorney. But it can include, of course, unwanted sexual advances or requests for sexual favors. And the harasser and the target of the harassment can be either a man or a woman, needless to say, and they can be of the same sex, and sexual harassment can still be happening. Although the law doesn't prohibit offhand comments that are few and far between, or very isolated incidents that a objective person would not view as serious, harassment does become illegal when it's so frequent or severe that it creates a hostile work environment and results in an objective person feeling, I am not safe here and I can't continue this employment. The harasser could be your supervisor, it could be a coworker, it could even be a client or a customer that your employer does not adequately protect you from. And the harassment can involve not just sort of requests for a sexual relationship, but commentary that is so derogatory toward women that it creates a hostile work environment and is sex-based. What can we do about this other than filing individual claims, which is, of course, a powerful tool? Employers should have zero tolerance policies in place related to sexual harassment and should conduct regular trainings about what's acceptable at the workplace. A common best practice is to require all staff to mandatorily report sexual relationships among staff of the organization to the employer, so that the employer can proactively ensure that there's not retaliation going on and not disparate treatment going on. Here in our hypothetical, the sexual advance and insinuation that sex with the mentor could help the employee get a chance at a better assignment are likely to be viewed by a judge or a jury as stereotypical sexual harassment. A word about the drinking, which was part of the hypothetical. Of course, the fact that the harasser was drunk does not excuse the behavior in any way. And in fact, it could make his description of his recollection of what happened less credible and less reliable to a jury. It could even help a jury potentially believe that he might have behaved in a way that was out of character for his sober self. The drinking is certainly a factor, not an excuse. And turning to the what happened when the employee complained, the retaliation piece of this hypothetical. So the employee, there are strong indications that by complaining to the director of this organization, the employee was pushed out. The indications, obviously come from what the director said: don't be a squeaky wheel, get along better with others. But they also, the inference of retaliation is also because of the adverse employment action, basically being pushed out of the organization so close in time to the complaint. And it's important with retaliation claims to understand that if you complain about conduct that made you feel harassed, and it later turns out that what happened probably doesn't rise to the level of being illegal sexual harassment, but you're retaliated against for having made the complaint, you are legally protected because that retaliation is unlawful, even if what you were complaining about ends up not having been unlawful. So if you feel that there's something wrong happening in your workplace, you have a legal protection to raise that complaint to the employer. What can our protagonist do? She can sue the employer for discrimination on the basis of pay, for failing to protect her from ongoing harassment, and for retaliating against her for her complaints. In some states, she could also sue the harasser individually and not just the organization. But how can she prove what happened in court? This is the question any of us would ask ourselves. The harasser will deny it. The director will side with him. And the thing to keep in mind here is that juries and judges very often hear he said, she said stories, and they get to decide which person they believe based on an assessment of their credibility and all of the circumstantial evidence that will support the story that the plaintiff, the complainant, is telling. So you don't necessarily need to have documentary proof. But that said, in many states, you may have the right to record in-person interactions or even telephone communications without notifying your interlocutor. Check your state law, but there may be opportunities to create some documentary evidence of what's happened. Keep detailed contemporaneous notes. What people used to do is write it and mail it, and it would be stamped by the Postal Service and people would know that it was contemporaneous, but now you can just put it in a Google Doc, a different one each day, and the metadata will show that you have not gone back and altered your journal. Take screenshots if there are text messages, save those emails and phone logs and videos. And, I guess I would suggest start to do that as soon as you start to feel an inkling of discomfort. Moving quickly, if you do decide you may want to bring a claim, is important. There is a 180-day statute of limitation under federal law for making a complaint of employment discrimination or sexual harassment, sex discrimination to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That's the federal agency that would take such a complaint. In some states, that 180 days has been extended to 300 days. Check your state law, but it's still less than 10 months. So the law, unfortunately, does require people who are experiencing harassment to move relatively quickly. That said, the time period would run from the last date where the harassment occurred. So if it's continuing, your clock does not start running. Our hypothetical employee was told she could be paid out for the rest of her year of employment if she signs a bunch of agreements. One of them was a non-disparagement agreement. So there is a lot of discussion in the media and in these types of cases about NDAs. I kind of want to disambiguate that term because some people use it to refer to non-disclosure agreements. Others, in other contexts, it refers to non-disparagement agreements. Non-disclosure agreements are often appropriate. They are intended to ensure that employees don't disclose certain non-public proprietary information about artworks, upcoming shows, proprietary techniques, etc. And they will generally be upheld if they're specifically tailored just to protect the employer's interest in maintaining that information confidential. The other NDA, though, is the non-disparagement agreement, which requires the signer to not say anything negative about the person on the other end of that agreement. These are very common in the context of settlement agreements where an employee has made a claim that they were mistreated. And some employers even have started to ask that non-disparagement agreements be signed at the onset of employment. To me, that is a warning flag and would raise some alarm bells about what is happening in that workplace. Is it legally okay for the employer to condition a payment on the signing of an NDA? Yes, it is for the most part, except there are certain states like California and New York that have passed local laws to make NDAs impermissible unless they are the express preference of the complainant. So the person who experienced harassment wants non-disclosure because they never want this story coming out for their own reasons. The important thing to know about defamation, this really is an entirely separate area of law, but is that truth is a defense to a defamation claim. If you only publish statements that are true, that is a very good first start to defending yourself against any type of defamation claim. And there's a short statute of limitations for defamation claims. It's only a year. One thing I should quickly note is that Title VII, which is the federal law against sex discrimination and sexual harassment, only applies to organizations that employ more than 15 people. This leaves out a lot of smaller employers, but smaller employers might be covered by state law, so check your state law. Independent contractors and interns are often not covered by Title VII. So there are certainly some loopholes, and this is an area of advocacy that we should all be engaging in. I'll just say something quickly before I end about school-based harassment. Title IX, as opposed to Title VII, Title IX protects people from discrimination based on sex in educational programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. So Title IX applies to schools, educational agencies, and other institutions that get federal funding from the Department of Education. If there's no federal funding, Title IX does not apply to that. The other thing to know with Title IX is that it does require, in order for you to have a claim, a legal claim, that the person experiencing the unlawful treatment notify an appropriate person, like a faculty member, a staff member, and if that person's response is inadequate, you then have a right to take the institution to court. I will wrap it up there, and when we're in the Q&A, we can talk further about other questions you have, but I'm going to pass it on to Sunshine.
Okay, so I think what was amazing to me about prepping for this panel was the fact that conversations with Dana and such really illuminated to me how most of the circumstances within ceramics and the sort of way that we do business aren't covered with many legal protections, and why I think it's so important. We need to push policy change within our organizations and institutions. And so anyways, the hypotheticals that I'm going to cover are kind of the grayer areas of our field that are really hard to They're not quite as overt, but they're uncomfortable. So I'm just going to really quick go through a couple of these scenarios. And then at the end of those, I have kind of personal checklists, recommended policies to ask of your organization. So that's where we're at. Okay, so you're joining a community studio. You've been looking around for someplace. You've been working from home, or you've moved and you have to find a new place, or you've been on pandemic lockdown, or maybe you're new to clay. And so you're trying to find a place to work with other clay folks, maybe take some classes. You find a studio. It seems great because it's close to your house. But then something happens. Basically, you have a run-in with a fellow community member, or you're taking a class and you're noticing that there's unwanted attention being given to the opposite sex, including yourself, and you're not quite sure what to do. But, you know, it's one of those things common in our field. There's always that one person in a studio that makes life uncomfortable for people. And, you know, you talk to the studio manager because you don't know what to do. And they're like, oh yeah, that's just blank. Fill in the blank of who that person is, and they just sort of tolerate that behavior. Another scenario here is that if you are looking for employment and trying to get a job as a class instructor at, say, a community studio, you're excited because you got a class, you go through all the paperwork, which mostly discuss what you get paid, and then the duties in addition to teaching, like firing kilns, cleanup, locking up, and a rundown of the studio workings and equipment. Most of the equipment you're familiar with, but there's some that you're not. And you hesitate to bring that up because this is your sort of first job and you need the money, right? Also, then you have a student, one of the students is starting to exhibit nasty behavior in your class and sort of dismisses your admonishments for behaving appropriately, and then starts to sort of passively aggressively act out in class towards you and the other students. And you have no clue what to do. Your class is after hours and management isn't present. Okay, another one. And this is, I think, applies to a lot of situations. It's kind of more generalized. You're starting a residency, an internship, or a assistantship. After applying to a number of opportunities, you have been selected for a long-term position. You're moving to a new location, a new studio, and you've received an acceptance call, an email, and maybe a brief list of dates for arrival and a possible stipend. You're going to turn your life upside down, pack up your belongings, studio and family or pets, and head to that new opportunity. So this is one of those things that came out, this next scenario is a wood fire scenario. And I hesitate to even read it because I think we all know the implications when I say wood fire scenario, that it just starts out very difficult. You know, it's very interesting to sort of wrap this up into a neat bow because we got so many stories about wood fire scenarios that were quite awful. You're participating in your very first wood firing. Your professor, teacher, mentor invites you to participate in an off-campus location for a firing. You're excited. You've been making work for weeks to bring to the kiln. When you get there, there are lots of tables of work, and your teacher and a few others are inside already starting to load the kiln. You unpack your work on some tables. Someone who you don't know directs you to put the work there. Looking around for something to do, you go and start chopping wood. Someone gives you a 3-minute tutorial on the wood splitter and sets you loose. Luckily, you've brought some gloves. You end up chopping up wood for a couple hours and decide to take a break and check on what's happening at the kiln. You notice a lot of work has been loaded into the kiln, but yours has not been touched. You're not sure what to do. You want your work to get in, but you don't want to be pushy. You watch for a while folks are handing pots in and get an idea on how it's working. Your teacher is deep in the kiln and not approachable at the moment. You decide to ask the person loading the work into the kiln if there's a better spot for your work so that it might have a chance to get in. They point someplace out, more in their eye line. And the day progresses and you get some work in the kiln, but you're exhausted as you went back to the wood splitter and chopped and stacked wood for a few more hours than your body could really manage. But you don't want to seem like you can't carry your weight. The other option we saw too was that people were excluded because of their gender for being able to participate in like heavy lifting activities, we'll call them. So you decide to set up your camp as there's no housing and you're signed up for a 6 a.m. kiln shift, your first. You get very little sleep as partying by the kiln goes on for hours. You arrive at your shift, your kiln partner is drunk and dozing on a nearby sofa. And there is a mess of party stuff, food, trash, and empty containers. You do your best to manage the kiln, given the instructions of the former person on shift and the passed out person on the sofa. How do you deal with this? Who do you talk to? So with all of that, I think most of you guys know there's so much that can happen within these circumstances that I think we have to really go in prepared and know what we're getting into. And I think that is, in part of the reason for this panel. But my little sort of checklist and then recommendations for policies for organizations, or, we use the word organizations a lot in this, and we also just mean like the people putting on the firing, right? That is an organization, that's an event, circumstance with which we need to kind of bring up the level of professionalism. So I'm just going to run through these real quick, which is a sort of personal checklist. So first, be informed. Know your employers, schools, studios, and other institutions' policies and hold them accountable. Define what professionalism means to you and in the larger ceramic field, and use that as a guide for how you participate in the field. Consent. You have the right to say no. Know your personal integrity structure and hold firm. Know your deal breakers from the start. If you find yourself stuck in a bad situation, be it relational, event-based, or institutional, for some bad situations, the only power you have is to leave and stop participating. Broaden your network. Sometimes in the ceramic field, we start off with a very narrow source of opportunities, stemming often from one person, our first teacher or mentor. What if that person happens to be toxic or abusive? Branch out as much as possible. Form a diverse pool of people to draw from. Good mentors and teachers will encourage you to do so. Limited opportunities coming from a toxic source or possible situations of retaliation can keep you trapped or drive one from the field, which we heard a lot of in the stories. No one person has power over your success or failure other than you. Then also understand your power structures. Understand your power structures you are involved with and act accordingly. Sometimes we forget our positions of influence in the casual nature of the ceramic field. People can look to you on how to act in your worst moments when you think you're off duty. Be mindful of your role and the space you occupy. The policies that you want to make sure that the organizations you work for or are part of, pay transparency and how that relates to fair pay. It's important to know when applying for a job. I believe Dana went over that. Diversity and equity statements and the work those institutions have done on this matter. Also, if they have sexual harassment policies, understand what a zero policy actually means in your institution. Also, whistleblower reporting protocols. How does the institution employer residency program handles reports of misconduct? Code of conduct. Have one for yourself, your professionalism, and expect them from your institutions and other circumstances. Demand equipment training. There's a lot of equipment in our field that can be very dangerous, and it's really important not to put yourself in peril because often our institutions also don't pay for our healthcare. So be very mindful of those asks when they ask for things. Don't be afraid to ask for training and safety protocols. Hostile work environment and what that can mean, because a lot of like those studio situations, those are basically hostile work environments. Read your contracts and agreements with institutions. Encourage clear employment contracts or agreements, especially in internship, apprentice, and assistantships. Recommended in sort of documentable formats. Disclaimer, I am not an expert, a counselor, or in any way trained in sexual harassment work. These call to action thoughts come from my own background, education and experience in life and the ceramic field. Put forward with the hope that we can learn to work together as humans to make spaces we inhabit safer and more inclusive to all folks. And all of these are written down in a document that we'll provide a link to everyone. So again, define new professionalism in the ceramic field for yourself and have an expectation of professionalism from all your ceramic organizations, institutions, and events. Understand we are a product of our larger culture. Avoid defensive posturing. Know that your experience is not the same as others. See intersectionality and privilege. Work to recognize we are all guilty of sexist thoughts and behaviors. Just don't let that be your endpoint. Engage and work to change behaviors and thinking patterns. Ending sexism begins with you and is aided by policy change in our spaces. Develop education, language, and skills around the subject of sexism. Make the spaces you inhabit safe for these discussions. They are messy, difficult, and uncomfortable, but it is important to have them in mixed and inclusive communities. Encourage and support policy change, development on all levels. Sexism is not just a ceramic problem, it is rooted in most cultures globally. However, our field is small and we have the power and momentum to create positive, lasting change to make our spaces safe and equitable. Men can be allies. When we talk of sexism and misogyny, we often see men in the role of perpetrator and readily abusing power. We have a system that still favors and upholds male leadership roles and white supremacy. Men should be held to account. However, men are the other half of the equation when we think of sexism as a problem. We need their help to make progress. We need allyship. It will be imperfect and take time, education, and participation. Okay, just a couple more, everybody, and then we'll be done. And this one's for men. Men, step up. Work to enact the policies discussed. Stand up to other toxic environments and behaviors you see. Stop standing idly by or handling toxic and dangerous behaviors and situations behind closed doors. We as a community need transparency and an end to the gatekeeping of toxic masculine culture in leadership roles or environments. An example of that is woodfire culture. If you look around at your event, organization, institution, residency, and all you see are cis white males, you have a problem on many levels. Don't just look at this year, look back historically, see and acknowledge the problem, then devote yourself to change, inclusion, and diversity. Celebrate these strides, be a leader in this effort. We need to normalize this growth and change in our ceramic community.
I am going to do a quick call to action myself, and then we're going to end with a Q&A. This is my own call to action, which overlaps with Sunshine's to some degree. You know, our field has really normalized bad behavior and protected and in fact lauded some of the worst offenders. We frame this behavior as boys will be boys and as an inevitable outcome of pervasive sexism and misogyny in the broader culture. We pat ourselves on the back believing we accept everyone when we don't. By doing so, we've accepted that women and anyone outside the patriarchy are collateral damage. This is not okay, and it was never okay. We've heard multiple versions of this comment. Quote unquote, Ken Ferguson wasn't great for women, but I never had any issues with him. He was a really great teacher. Then there's like this flurry of accolades and horror stories that follow as if this is a kind of badge of honor to have sort of endured such abuse at his hands. This is really no longer an acceptable stance. We're committing as a community to take care of everyone and not turning a blind eye to abuse that does not directly involve us. I think this is a moral imperative, and any system of supremacy damages all of us. I think we need a really radical paradigm shift from sexism and misogyny being a women's issue to being a men's issue or a patriarchy issue. We're asking you to become an upstander, to speak out in private and public situations where you see manifestations of sexism and misogyny. We want you to disrupt the cycle. History is one way that women's contributions have been erased and rewritten to benefit male dominance. Jenni spoke about some women artists who've been overshadowed and pushed out. Please also think about the labor of the wives of famous artists and the myth put forward that those men are geniuses that had no help in their rise to fame. When every field is questioning accepted narratives that reinforce oppression, so institutions renaming buildings, cities taking down monuments, I feel like every field is really doing this except for our field. The question is really why. We continue to uphold mythologies and the old boys club. And the old boys club is really a system of gatekeeping and nepotism. Because we're a field built on legacy, conversations around icons are shut down immediately. We've seen this on social media quite a few times. This is really misogyny in action. It's the policing of sexism to uphold the system. I think it's time that we invest in feminist historical scholarship to re-examine ceramics' most celebrated icons like Volkas, Ferguson, and Solder, and what impact they've had on the field or those who've been marginalized. Does it continue to make sense to name prestigious fellowships after people who have done as much harm as good? Considering the impact of his posters, is Soldner the best choice as someone to celebrate at an upcoming wood fire conference whose theme is racial and gender equity? This is not cancel culture. This is truth-telling. This is holding multiple narratives at once. This is valuing the dignity of all human beings. We need to accept that these icons have contributed positively and negatively to our field, and we're still dealing with the negative impacts. Our heroes are flawed, as all heroes are. Recommendations for organizations. We've had well over 1,000 registrants. There are almost 400 people here tonight. We have an enormous reach, and we ask that each of you go back to the organizations that you work for, that you care about, that you support, and ask them what trainings, protocols, and policies they have in place. These measures should be anti-oppressive and support the well-being of communities that have traditionally been marginalized. BIPOC folks, the LGBTQ+ community, disabled colleagues, and friends. If they don't have these policies in place, call them to task. I think we need to grow out of our adolescence as a field. We need to become more professional across the board. There's too much gray area that in actuality we have a hard time admitting is toxic in a lot of respects. This means wood firing becomes a professional space, not a party space. We need to stop drinking in professional settings and not to use it as an excuse for harmful behavior. So ultimately, accountability lies with the person doing the harm. I'm putting NCECA in the hot seat here, even though they have graciously sponsored this panel, because I feel like they have the most kind of power to affect change quickly. We commend NCECA for working with consultants to revamp their sexual harassment response and reporting mechanisms. We know they're doing that hard work right now. And as much as NCECA is something that many of us look forward to annually, it's also a place where many things converge into a perfect storm. You have young people away from home for the first time. You have big egos, power dynamics, drinking, hotel rooms. In the Google form, a lot of the submissions mention this kind of bro culture of drinking and how it really creates an unsafe environment for vulnerable people. We ask NCECA to lead the field by creating a task force to address sexism and misogyny through an intersectional lens. We want them to collect comprehensive data about incidents and forms of sexism and misogyny in our field. We want them to hold listening sessions. We want them, and this is probably the most important thing, is to implement preventative measures at the conference and year-round, and to establish ongoing sexual harassment trainings aimed specifically at men, just like there are workshops for glazes and critiques for students. So this discussion and training really needs to be built into the fabric of NCECA. And again, we want to thank NCECA for their leadership and their ability to hear what we're saying as a community. They're supporting us on this panel, and even as we critique them. So I think in a lot of ways, I think that's what we want every organization is to do, is to really value their constituents that way. We want to share with you our budget for this Sexism and Ceramics panel. Many of you know that this panel was originally put together by the Women Working with Clay Symposium, and we moved it off that platform because we wanted it to be free and have the recording be accessible after the panel. But Sunshine, do you want to jump in here and talk about the budget and talk about fair pay?
Yes, sure. One of the things I really advocate for is fair pay in our field. And, even working with this panel, I sort of learned the term pay transparency. We weren't going to be paid to originally do this panel, but I also feel like we've spent a lot of time working on this and people deserve to be paid for their time. So the honorariums are just 500 each. I think Dana and Jenni are both possibly donating theirs. But both Ayumi and I are independent artists working, and it's really important to us to be paid for our time. And also just the cost of upgrading the Zoom and different things, and our wonderful technical support, Sadie, and then some consultant fees. And so also Nsika sponsored us and contributed a large amount. And then if we get any donations over the amount that we need to cover costs, it'll be donated to Time's Up. And if anybody has any questions about that, please feel free to email me.
Thanks, Sunshine. I think maybe Dana, do you want to just jump in and talk about Time's Up?
The Time's Up organization runs actually a legal fund that will help fund for plaintiffs and plaintiffs' attorneys, because there's a recognition that these cases are expensive to take on, and there may not be lawyers who are willing to take them on without a paying client, and that's rare. It's an amazing organization where you can confidentially, submit some information about your claim, and you can get funding for litigation, and, we'll direct excess donations there.
Dana, there was a question that came in earlier. Can you legally say you've signed a non-disparagement agreement while holding to that agreement and not saying anything negative?
So you signed a non-disparagement agreement, so you're not going to say anything negative, but what you want to say to the person asking you questions is, I signed a non-disparagement agreement. And that's a really good question. The answer is yes, if all you signed was a non-disparagement agreement. If you signed additionally a confidentiality agreement, what that will probably say is that you cannot just disclose to anyone the existence of the settlement agreement. So in that case, which is usually what happens actually, people aren't allowed to disclose that there's been a settlement or a settlement payment at all. And instead, they accept the settlement and just decline to answer questions. It depends on how you negotiate that document, what you can say.
Now, maybe I'll just throw out this one that I see in the chat right now. I'm going to send this over to Sunshine from Jenni. Can you expand on transparency and the problem with closed door conversations?
Yeah, I think what happens behind closed doors is that things are not addressed in a way that will make the environment feel like there's accountability. Like it might have been a circumstance that only affected 2 people, and say a group, say we'll use a residency, for example, there's 10 to 20 people around, or it's in a studio where what happens with the 2 people can be toxic to an entire environment. And to not have any clarity about how things were dealt with or repercussions for behaviors, it perpetuates a mystique, or I think some kinds of real problems, because people don't feel safe any longer, or they don't feel heard, or they do feel like they've been completely sort of dismissed in their concerns in the environment that they're working.
Jenni, this one's for you. I wonder how or if the advent of social media has affected the issue of women being pushed out. At least now women can control their own voice and disseminating their work to some extent, though accessing the fine art galleries is still difficult without an expensive degree and or the right connections.
That's a really good point. We're in a different era, certainly, than the era that I'm talking about, which is clearly pre-internet, pre-digital. I think that there's still expectations for women, and that women are socialized to behave. They're socialized to make way for others, to let other people speak up first. There's a kind of politeness factor that I think that it's really hard to overcome as women. I think that this is something that's hard to figure out, how to not let other people go first, talk over people. Somebody mentioned in the chat something about men dominating crits. I still see that all the time. When I teach, when I go to people's studios, it's a common problem in classrooms too. And I think that academia is still a space in which women feel demoralized a lot of the time. I know that's not a positive way to end, but I think that yes, women can take charge and take charge of their own social media platforms. And I think that that's all to the greater good. But I do think that this larger question of institutional change is really, really important. And we have to be the people to lean on our institutions. And I think that that's also something that women did weirdly a century ago in forming the settlement house movement and creating social work situations, because there wasn't a space for it, and that women always end up being at the helm of making social change and making lives better for women and children everywhere, even though they get chastised as the sort of moral force, like for temperance or chastity or, you know, any of those other sorts of movements. I don't know, it's a bigger conversation, but a really good point.
I just was thinking, somebody emailed right before we went on today, and how we decide to introduce women, how we decide to promote female-led exhibitions, things like that, in the where the language is like, oh, there were really simple qualifications. You had to be a woman and you had to be a wood fire, right? Like, what does that exactly say? You know, that it doesn't really set apart this idea that how important it is that we recognize people working in the field doing excellent work. We're still marginalizing our language a lot, in that, you know, I've come across circumstances where, you know, male support, you know, men trying to be allies still say, well, I'm sorry women feel this way. And it's like, well, women don't feel this way. Women are marginalized. And so we have to sort of get away from describing women sometimes in these emotional words and emotional and kind of that context of separating them out, I think, in marginalizing ways.
I think part of, you know, the challenge also with the Google Forms is it's such sensitive information. It takes so much emotional labor to even write these stories down, and being careful about where this information goes. Like, those are like real fears. So it's like, how do we use that information in a way that actually makes change? And in this panel, we kind of just, you know, created these like hypothetical cases to help people. But I think that there are a lot of people who, you know, have turned to social media as a way to like call out people and to like really confront it head on. And I feel like there's like no really good mechanism to support those people once they've called people out. And yeah, often it doesn't feel like it's as effective as it could be. I feel like really committed to like trying to figure out a solution to this, because this panel is just the beginning of this conversation. I feel like we have some amazing minds in this conversation tonight, so I feel pretty confident we'll be able to come up with a solution. Kind of related to this is there's a question about how you deal with smaller situations like apprenticeships, which are usually one-on-one, and there's no HR director or director to complain to.
I feel, I mean, that's sort of in my court. I think it's really difficult. I think that's why we're sort of promoting really going into a situation and having clear definitions. That's really important. I think once you find yourself in a circumstance and you're having a problem, you know, I think this relates kind of to what Ayumi was just saying. Everyone is going to be at a different level with this kind of work, and their understanding of how to proceed is going to be different. And it's like impartial, it's power dynamic, right? It's a very difficult thing if you're an employee and you're trying to confront someone that is respected in the field or has a big online presence or whatever the criteria was that made you want to work with them. And so I think it is really important to develop and learn language about how to talk about the problems that we have, because I also think it's really important to communicate. I mean, that's part of that idea of allyship, is that we need to say, what you're doing right now is making me uncomfortable. I'm not happy, or I feel unsafe, like whatever those things are. Of like, as a woman, I know, like I know in my body if something's not quite right. I may not have the words yet, and sometimes I have to step back and go, okay, what exactly about that was causing me distress? And really identifying that and coming back with a bit more, less of a defensive, like scared response, and a real call to action to say, hey, what happened? Because it's also really important to be able to call back and say, hey, listen, what happened made me uncomfortable. I want things to change. Or the truth is, you have to know your exit strategies for places. If people are not willing to change, that is their prerogative in some way, so.
Here's a question for Dana, though I feel like Jenni might jump in here also. She writes, I recently emailed a past professor about the misconduct at my alma mater and how alum and even the professor himself have abused, belittled, and assaulted women who were and are students from the university. The professor did not write back. The original email was in March. I had a Zoom meeting with a woman who is now the grad chair. She used to be an art history professor, and I really trusted her and still trust her. How do I move forward personally? I feel like accountability is or may not be reached. I know you don't know the specifics of their policies, but
I mean, with Title IX complaints, which it sounds like this is, the statute of limitations for actually making a complaint is based on state law. In some states it's 1 year, in some states it's 3 years. So kind of depending on what happened, there may still be an avenue available in that direction. I do believe that making a record, making complaints, and making sure that what you are saying gets into someone's file and gets heard by, people in leadership is in itself very important. And that can have effects on the institution that you don't end up seeing.
What about reaching out to people you were at school with or other alums?
Sure. I mean, this is the type of thing that could, it could be a very thoughtful and legitimate, magazine article, and it could be a piece that talks about people's experience and is totally true and could describe people's experiences anonymously if the journalist is comfortable with that, but it could get the word out that way.
Linda Christensen brings up the idea of restorative justice. I mean, personally, I really love that idea. And I feel like there's a way in which people have discounted cancel culture. I can see why. I mean, I think sometimes it can be incredibly effective for people who have no power, or feel like they have no power. But I think like a field like ours that is so dependent on relationships, I think it makes sense to start to explore truth and reconciliation as a way to create positive change. It's something that I'd like to start looking at.
I think the other thing is that people often, at least faculty, from my perspective, wait people out. Eventually people do retire who suck. It takes a long time. It's annoying to have to wait for them. It never affects the students. Students are never there long enough, but eventually you can turn over the culture of a department. It takes a long time. It's years in the making, but I would encourage whoever's writing that letter to the current chair, like, do it for yourself. Don't do it because you're trying to, you won't be able to fix your own experience other than try to, get to some space of feeling, I don't know, feeling at peace in some way in yourself. But I think that if you're going to call somebody out for that reason, great. But I don't know that it's going to do anything within an academic situation because institutions are so slow moving. And I would say from my experience in university culture, the Title IX office exists essentially to protect the university from lawsuits. They're not really there to help people individually. They're trying to cover their own ass ultimately and document everything. But my department went through a Title IX situation. It was very disheartening on the other end of it to see what happened. Everybody was interviewed, you got your say, but at the end of the day, it was really about making sure that the institution had covered all of its legal bases and was not sued.
Can I pick up on that? Because the Title IX office is like the HR department at an employer. They exist to protect the institution. They don't represent you. When I'm talking about the Title IX process, I mean to communicate that you must make a complaint through the Title IX office in order to have a right to go to court. But in my view, it's only when you really get, I'm sure there are some situations where the Title IX office helps, but it's only once you get to a judge or a jury outside of the educational or the employment institution that you're likely to get the redress that you're looking for.
Here's an interesting question for both Sunshine and Dana. Sunshine last summer mentioned the formation of a union of ceramicists. Is there any more movement on that? And Dana, I bet you might have something to say about that also. What is possible for independent artists to form a union?
It's a union in a not in a traditional sense, I guess. It would be a non-majoritarian union. It would, it'd be a collective. It would be a union, but not in a labor law sense.
Yeah.
But it would be an organization that can work together to change policies at multiple employers.
I think that's why in a weird way, the sort of policy change, this individual's asking on every level for pay transparency, for movement on the sort of, because I think it's also, I support the women's conference that we were supposed to attend, but it's also everyone that paid to go to that expected that some of that money was going towards the people presenting. And like, we need to know what we're paying people. And you're right in that I'm not quite sure. I think why there's been no movement is it is really difficult to try to know what to do across all 50 states if we're just talking about the US. And I unfortunately do not know enough about how to do that yet. So, but it is something that definitely, that sort of a little bit more consistency across institutions would be important.
Dana, I don't know if you answered this regarding Title IX. Do you think that other students coming forward with similar stories will make a difference, even if it is after the statute of limitations? Or does it have to get to court to make a difference?
It's impossible to say, but yes, I think absolutely. More voices telling the same story hopefully creates a situation where it's just untenable for the school to continue. That is pressure, but it's not, a legal requirement to take a different action.
This is a question for me. What will be done with all the stories submitted through Google? I don't think it's great data hygiene to not know, but it's my hope that a feminist scholar will be able to use this material someday, and we won't use any or share any information without your permission first. But it just feels like we need more first, and Jenni, please jump in. We need more first-hand accounts about the post-World War II generation of educators, because it just feels like there's not enough education or information out there, and those people who studied with them are getting older also.
Well, and I think it's also really important, I think having read through all of those testimonials and shared experiences, what I wanted to do was get men in a room and read them to them. That idea of like how we allow, how much space men take up in our field, and how incredibly painful and even the sort of smallest acts can diminish people's experience in this business. And I think we don't know what we want to do with it, but I think there is something really powerful there of helping folks understand the consequences and long-term consequences. I mean, Jenni sort of said, oh, well, it doesn't affect students, but the reality is like a bad instructor, it lasts a lifetime for some people.
Definitely. I'm saying it doesn't change. The culture doesn't change fast enough for students to win is what I really meant, is that when you have a 2-year MFA program or even a 3-year MFA program, the changes implemented are not quick enough institutionally. Institutions are so slow and so bureaucratic and so defensive and self-protecting. One
thing I'd like to just get back to quickly is that the protocol for changing Wikipedia entries, they're using third-party or like published material, right? And that published material is scholarly research. So to get a fuller picture of an individual, it's like we need to have papers written about those people. In order for papers to be written about those people, we need to collect information. So it would be great to put us in contact or send the link to people that you know were, you know, say in those Soldner posters or worked with Volkas. Anybody in that generation who was studying at that time. I think it would be great to start collecting a document for resources, but it would be wonderful to have everybody work on that collectively. So I want to thank the other panelists, Jenni, Sunshine, and Dana, for their expertise, their wisdom, their generosity, and being here tonight. And to
Yes.
all of you also for contributing.
And also everyone that contributed money, thank you. I think we've met our goal, so I so appreciate that. It's so helpful and
great.
really generous of everyone. So
We really appreciate the interest and the outpouring of information and support and generosity, and also the idea of seeking change. And that's a real thing. And, you know, we all want that collectively.
thank you so much, everyone, for participating in the panel talk and for your interest and support in this conversation. We are hoping that this is just the beginning of the conversation. Ayumi and I have already talked about furthering the discussion, planning to sort of work with NCICA maybe in the fall and have another type of panel talk. I know that there were lots of comments and resources shared during the meeting that we're hopefully compiling and be able to address more issues. We were only able to address kind of a very specific sector of the conversation. And so we are looking at this as just the beginning of the conversation, and with your help, we'll carry it on. Thank you so much for attending. And I'm really hopeful and encouraged by the support and conversations that have been started because of this. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Ayumi and I say thank you so much. Bye.